Hey everybody, today we're talking about neuroscience, AI, and the detection of dementia and other brain health conditions early. My guest is Hamzah Selim, and he's the co-founder of MindStep. Now, MindStep, it's like an app. Well, it is an app. It's not like an app, it is an app, where patients can report their symptoms, and machine learning is going to find correlations in all that data and essentially screen for some conditions and pick up some conditions early. It's even been able to start to quantify brain fog. So, you know, that kind of feeling where everything's a bit foggy, you can't remember things, your concentration's low, you're inhibited, your cognition is inhibited. You sort of colloquially refer to it as brain fog, and what their machine learning's been able to do is to pick that up and identify it almost as like a new condition, and they're in the process of submitting that to neurology conferences, and eventually they'll go to NICE and things like that. Hamzah talks about it on the episode, so that's incredibly interesting. But yeah, Hamzah's a doctor. He was signing investor term sheets with Octopus Ventures at the same time as doing finals, so he knows a little bit about multitasking. But he's a man that also appreciates context. He says he's a data and AI company, and he makes very data and AI-based decisions, or at least data-based decisions in his company. He's a man that likes context. He likes to get as much information as possible from people and from feedback in order to make the right decisions for himself and his company. Really enjoyed this one. Hope you guys do too. Hamzah, welcome to the Healthtech Podcast. How you doing, mate?
Good.
Man, good to have you on. Yeah, followed MindStep for a little while and seen what you guys are up to. Obviously, a very, very noble cause, very cool company, some great investors, and you guys are onto some really good things. So looking forward to getting into this, man, and hearing about it. You're a young founder as well, and so I'm keen to get your story and hear all about you. But before we do, yeah, whereabouts are you speaking to us from today, mate? Where are you based?
Yeah, I'm in Camden, near UCL, which is where I graduated from, actually.
Oh, nice. Where are the MindStep offices? Have you got offices in this modern world? Do you work hybrid? Do you work at home?
Yeah, I mean, we did the hybrid thing for a year or so. It was good. It has like its positives. I can see the benefit of like working side by side. But then we would do it like 2 days a week or a couple of days, and everyone when they came to the office was just so excited to see each other.
Yeah.
Like I'd be buzzing to see everyone. So you just chat, which is lovely, but it wasn't everyone would come from the day being like, oh, I'm not really that productive. And it feels like we're just renting a space to like buzz with each other, which is good. But the London rents are horrendous. So I was like, why don't we just try remote? And I'll just use that money that we spend on office rent to like take everyone out to the pub or the park, or we can go play football instead. Like, why we just like stood around a pool table in a sweaty office when we can just probably do this more fun, more cheaply elsewhere. So yeah, we're trying remote now actually, and we have to see how that goes. But I'm honestly still trying to figure out what the best configuration is.
Yeah, so same. And because we talk about it, like, should we move to the office thing? We are remote, it works really well, but people say like they are enjoying remote. It feels like the team's super close. It feels like we've got that camaraderie anyway. And when we do meet up, yeah, we just tend to do more fun stuff, and it seems to work. But it's a minefield. I actually spoke to I don't know if you know Patients Know Best, but I spoke to Mohammed, the founder of that company. Yeah. And they've been remote, I think he said since like 2008 or something. He's been doing it for so long, and he just sees so much value in it, and talked to me about how and why and all that stuff. If anybody listening wants to go back and listen to that one, it's one of the ones previous to this. But yeah, no, super cool company, man. And they've been remote for a long time. But anyway, we digress. Mate, it'd be good to hear your story, man. I know that, as I say, you're a young founder, and you've also done a few bits before now. So yeah, tell me all about it, man. How do you tell me all about the run up to MindStep?
Yeah, sure. So I suppose a bit about myself. So I grew up in Germany, and then I came to London for uni. I studied medicine, and I also did like at UCL, and I also did like a BSc in neuroscience and at Imperial. And it was actually whilst I was at Imperial that I was really always fascinated by the brain, and I thought it was like, although neurology is really hard and I did terrible in my OSCEs you all know what OSCEs are, but maybe for the viewers or listeners, OSCEs are like the type of exam we have to go through, and they're really tricky. But I always felt that like your brain, was like the ultimate frontier. It's like your identity. It's how it works. It's so much more complicated than like anything we understand. And I was always fascinated by that, especially the clinical side. And I was in a lecture actually, and we were learning OSCEs, and I was like, oh God, my least favorite thing. And we were doing one particular thing. We were doing like the cranial nerve test. I don't know if you remember this, James, back to your med school days, where you're like waving. And for those that might not have medical background, it's basically where you assess like the nerves in your face, and you might have had this test done to you in A&E if you got hit in the head or something, or experiencing some neurological symptoms. They'll basically like test the nerves, and one test is like called the H test. I remember this very distinctively, and it was like you wave your finger in front of a patient and be like, oh, can you follow my finger with your eyes? And I was having one of those like really archaic neuro profs at Imperial, with a little bow tie, and he was just telling me, he's like, oh, all you junior doctors and med students, you always do this wrong. You have to be looking at like the subtle flicker of the pupil and correct distance. And I was like, bloody hell, this is really hard. I love neuro, but it just seems so difficult. And like a good medical student, I got distracted and started. This was a few years ago, like 4 years ago, and I started playing around on my phone on Snapchat. I, rather embarrassingly, was using the dog filter to communicate to my mates as a Gen Z would, and I swear this has relevance. So I was doing that, and whilst Snapchat placed this like dog filter on my face, it tracks your eye movement and your facial expressions to like map the ears perfectly, and like the silly tongue and stuff. And I was like, why is Snapchat able to perfectly track my eye movement and my facial expression, and like regardless of what distance I'm at to the phone, but a room full of 300 medics can't seem to get this H test right? And I was like, it's fair play to Snapchat. I'm a big fan of the filters, but it felt like the application of this technology would perhaps be more beneficial to society if it was implemented to detect, early neurodegenerative disease, or all the things that we do with like a cranial nerve examination. And then that got me like thinking, neurology and psychiatry are kind of unique in their fields, in the sense that it's a lot of like communication to extract the information from the patient, and then it's a lot of like maybe gross motor function, and then with a lot of that you can often make a diagnosis, as opposed to like maybe cardiology, where you need like your stethoscope, or gastro, you need like endoscopy or complex hardware to really get to diagnosis. And I was like, this field could be pretty much translated onto a phone. Very bold statement to make from such a young medical student, but I honestly didn't know any better at the time. And I think that is kind of like a good trait to have in a founder. Like sometimes when you're so deep in the field, you just think everything is impossible. But if you're kind of like fresh at it, I just didn't know. I was like, yeah, why not? Like cranial nerve, this seems like all of neurology. Obviously it's not, but I was like, we can just start with that. Why not? I got a couple of medics together that were more experienced than me. I got some brave registrars, and I was like, let's just see if we can translate it onto a phone. And what started as like one cranial nerve test, I was like, okay, no one really actually has cranial nerve palsies. Maybe we can do something more relevant. And I was like, okay. And at this point, I was like, it was COVID kind of kicking off, and UCL were like having us volunteer in hospitals, and I was like seeing what the problems of the NHS and patients were, and I was like, wow, dementia is really something that's very common. It's often patients are presenting really late to A&E, and it feels like that could be something where there would be a benefit to diagnosing earlier. And the tests around dementia, like the MMSE, MOCA, seemed really translatable. So we started building it onto the product. We started trying it out with patients. And then when we translated the tests onto a device, I didn't appreciate that it unlocked quite a few things. So first, for example, patients from anywhere could start using it. they didn't need to sit in a clinic or A&E. And obviously during COVID, that was super impactful, as we couldn't get near patients at the time. And it's still, like in a post-COVID era, that's one of the things that I think patients really like being able to be have a remote consultation, like not having to always go to the GP to receive care. And then we also were digitalizing the whole process in a way that had never been done before. So it was like tracking, your eye movement down to the millimeter, right? It wasn't just a consultant being like, yeah, I know, in a binary sense. It was like taking this richness and huge amount of data, which we were then running through machine learning algorithms to try, train it like a consultant to really like pick up the early signs and stuff. And with the sheer volume of patients that started, going through the app and the amount of data going through this algorithm or the AI essentially, it started to become very, very good, like phenomenal at detecting the early warning signs of not only dementia, but it started to be able to exclude other conditions. It started to, point us in the direction of new conditions that we weren't really fully appreciating. So we've actually just done this massive data analysis project, like 50,000 brains on brain fog. It's a condition that we often hear in GP land, but we don't, really appreciate what it is. So because we had loads of people reporting brain fog, we were able to like map that to other symptoms and be like, okay, this is actually what brain fog is. And we've just submitted it to like the European National Conference for Neurology, and it received like a huge, like welcome in that field, which is hard in neurology because it's sometimes very resistant to change. That is essentially the story of like how MindStep founded, and it's gone through like ups and downs and different things, and the team has grown to like 20 people now and funding rounds, etc. But yeah, that's where we're at.
That's awesome, man. There's quite a lot I want to talk to you about here, and I'm going to spare the listeners from talking about OSCEs too much, but like, mate, how stressful were OSCEs? Oh my goodness, they were just horrible. Like we talked off air just now about like, things that stress you out now versus when you were a medical student doctor. Like OSCEs, I think, were peak stress for me. Like the fact that I had to go and do like basically 12 exams in like a very short space of time, and just be like critiqued on my behavior and stuff, like as I was doing them, like, oh my goodness, it was so stressful. But I'm going to spare the listeners from hearing about that.
It's not even realistic, is it? It's just not even how you would actually interact with the patient. I don't understand.
Do you know what? I am going to bore people now, because I can remember, right, final year OSCE, the abdo exam station. So you've got to go over, you've got to examine this guy's abdomen. So you've got to remember all the steps. And it's a very sort of, if you've done any educational theory, it's very sort of behaviorism, this kind of like the way you've got to learn OSCEs. It's very like, you've just got to memorize a list of actions. And that was something I never really liked doing. I like to learn with like critical realism, I guess, of like the knowing why I'm doing it and to understand it, and that's the way I like to learn things. Whereas in an OSCE, you've just got to learn a load of steps in a row of how to do it. But anyway, did this abdo exam. Everything appeared incredibly normal, apart from like a couple of scars that I couldn't really piece together. And I remember like feeling around this guy's liver, being like, is this enlarged? Like, would this guy be sat here in an OSCE with a liver that enlarged, like down like near his groin? And I was like, this can't be right. I was like, have they just thrown in like a normal exam? And looking at this guy, I was like, is this a normal exam? But he's got these scars like that. Anyway, I ended up presenting it as like, do you know what? I think this is normal. Like, it's all. Anyway, to cut long story short, the examiner was like, I can see you feeling around the liver. Like, you thought that was enlarged, didn't you? And I was like, yeah, but I didn't want to say it, like, because I couldn't really, like. He was like, this guy's got hepatorenal syndrome, and he's got like a third kidney, and he's got this and that, the other. And I was just like, okay, like, is that something that I'm going to have to diagnose with just my hands, like, in the rest of my medical career? Like, how realistic is this? But anyway, I suppose they're assessing quite a lot there to give them their due. But my goodness, did I get that wrong? Like,
oh man, I've had like equally. This wasn't my story, but I've done similarly embarrassing things where you go in and maybe it's like a simple one, like take blood pressure, and they, you just go in, you're so stressed out, you just like grab the examiner's arm, start doing it on them, and you're just like looking at you, being like, I'm not the patient.
Oh, that's fantastic. That's incredible. Yeah, that's incredible.
Yeah, I honestly think there'd be an amazing. My next startup idea is to film the Oskies. I just think they would be so funny. Like it would be like the weirdest reality TV show. You can call it Oski Island. 12
Yep.
candidates go round.
I think it's great because you could eliminate people. You could, I mean, there's so much drama in the run up of like, I mean, we used to, I don't know how much of this is going to make it into the edit of this podcast, but like my good, I can remember in our house of medics, we like set up like an Oski station where like one of the stations was just the timekeeper and the bell, and you'd hit the bell and then you'd run to each other's rooms and just pretend you had some other like pathological like thing. Like, oh my God, just so stressful. Anyway, Oskies are stressful. We've bored everyone. If there's anyone still listening, I want to move us now onto a bit of entrepreneurship stuff. You talked about the naivety of fresh eyes and that beginner mindset, and that is what basically gave you or set you on the path of essentially this mammoth task that you probably didn't know how mammoth it was, or at least you saw like the start of the red thread of like, oh, this could be a nice little red thread to pull, but turns out it's absolutely enormous with all these like complicating factors and all the rest of it. And so many founders I hear say the same thing, which is like, if I'd known how complicated it was at the start, I probably wouldn't have done it. And that seems to be like a common thing. And I'd say the same almost about what I'm doing now or things I've done in the past. You're starting an accelerator and potentially raising a fund. Like, you don't know how difficult that'll be when you start it. All these things that I've done as well. But I want to come back to the thing, right? The naivety of fresh eyes and that beginner mindset. I think that is absolutely crucial. Can you just expand on that for me about like, how fresh were those eyes? How little did you know before you started this? And how did the task appear in front of you when you did start pulling on that thread?
I mean, it was about as fresh as like someone just starting like their career in medicine. Like you've just got the Krebs cycle under your belt, maybe. Like you think medicine is just a bunch of pathways, maybe, and you have a little bit of patient exposure, but you have a lot of passion. You can like see a bit. At that point, I mean, where the way UCL and Imperial do their like curriculums, it's very like science heavy to start with, and then the clinical stuff is like later on. It's kind of like gatekeeped a bit. And I was like, I'm really this stuff seems cool. What this Krebs cycle stuff, get away from me. So I was like really hungry to start diving into it, but obviously didn't know. And I think you need both that like curiosity and the naivety. I think if you're just naive, like that's probably not a very good recipe, but you have to be like willing to keep pulling at that string. And then I also think what's really important is the ability to like listen to other people who might know more than you in the field. And even if they're like, oh, James, this is really tough. Like this is a tough like field. Don't you don't know what you're getting yourself into. Maybe if that's that, but just read through the lines, be like, okay, but why is it tough? Like what's happened to you on your journey that's made it so difficult to you, and how can I like mitigate that for myself or my mission? And I was really lucky to have like people that maybe weren't too scarred up from the going through the NHS or like doing like a really hard field like neurology. They were like, yeah, it is tough, but like maybe if you go that way, it might be easier for you. And I think you have to have like that honest conversation with being able to learn quickly and pivot. And if you do something wrong, like that's okay. You're still early days in your even if you're like now like we just closed like 3 funding rounds, I still feel like we're early days, and making mistakes is fine. You have to be able to like pivot and maneuver.
I want to talk about that a bit more, because one of the things I heard about feedback, one of the sort of good things that I heard about feedback is, listen to feedback and get feedback, but don't listen to all of it. I think what you've just said there is actually even more wisdom than that. And I really like how practical you've just explained that. When people give you feedback, particularly, that's so hard, I wouldn't bother. That's quite common, particularly from people that have been in a field a long time that are genuinely qualified to tell you something like that. You may be in danger of listening to it. You may be in danger of not listening to it. Both are probably equally dangerous for different reasons. But I think it's really nice what you said there. Like, ask those people, why is it tough, do you think? And you said something there. What has happened to you in your journey that led to you thinking that? That That is a fabulous question because that gives you context. And with context, you can apply far more data to your current situation to figure out, okay, is this feedback valid for me in my situation? So I really like that. I really like the idea of asking, and that I also think that's a really respectful question. I think that's a question that I think it gives the person respect for their opinion is valid too, but my opinion might also be valid based on my situation. And so you're really sort of allowing for both things to be true there. Not your feedback is bad, my taking of it is right or wrong. You're saying that we could both be right here, so can you give me more context? So I really like that about feedback. When you were talking about the idea with people and those experts, was it broadly people saying it's a good idea, broadly people saying it's a bad idea? Were people saying literally do not bother doing this? What was it actually like when you were casing like the idea at that stage?
Oh, it was, I mean, early, I would say it was like 95% get back to your Anki deck.
Wow.
Sort of vibes. And that's medical translate for get out of my lab or go back onto the wards. And it was brutal, but I did have it wrong at that time. Like it would have been dumb to build an app that assess your cranial nerves, like who needs that, right? And that was like the message that I needed to tease out amongst all the like being laughed out of the room and like being told like, why are you doing this, and like all the other things. They were actually trying to say this is not cost effective. This is in their especially like when you hear it from medics, they don't know the lingo of this will not have product market fit. That is what they were like trying to tell me in NHS medical language / go revise. Don't try. They were just like, oh, you don't have product market fit. But it took me ages to figure out. And I would also say, like, just in terms of coming out to your point about feedback, what was helpful is diversifying your opinion set. And I think this is something I've like tried to really keep true now. Like when we have like a big board, I always try to like not create like the echo chamber, although as tempting as it is, because you want to like have people that are like-minded to you, it's often though more uncomfortable to have people that actually are going to like be a bit frictionful and like really call you out for your stuff. And like I've got really like been really privileged to have like a diversified, at that time even I was like seeking advice from like like the Quit Genius boys were a few years above me, so and I like played football with them, so I was like talking to founders that were in the space. I was talking to neuro registrars. I was talking to like someone whose grandma had dementia. Like those were all like really important data points that I needed to hear in order to really tease out like why or how I could go about this.
The other thing that I want to say there about the feedback side of things is that particularly when you're getting clinical feedback, I see this a lot with founders, and I speak to a lot of people that have sort of been quite bruised by that very definitive binary feedback that they will get from clinicians. You see people like Junaid, he's probably listening. Hi Junaid, like on LinkedIn, being very front-footed and saying like, look, this isn't going to work. This is terrible because. But clinicians do live in the binary. Clinicians do live in the yes, no, abstain. That's how we're taught. That's how we're told to communicate things. You either give the drug at this dose or you don't. It's this or it's not, or you just say you don't know. So if clinicians have an opinion, it's either yes or no quite often, because that's how we're trained. And clinicians are also trained to find problems in things, find problems in their own lives. That's why they're difficult to be happy sometimes. But clinicians are trained to find problems in things as well. And so that's where clinicians will often find their internal reward mechanism is like, they'll think they're doing a real service to you by that analysis and finding out what's wrong, rather than just placating you by saying, oh, it might work because. It's actually, no, this won't work because of this thing. And actually that's a gift. It can just be delivered in a way that can be quite bruising, let's just say. So I do see that a lot,
Yeah, no. I think they're just so different worlds. Like startup, being a founder, and like being your traditional NHS doctor. They're almost like Yeah, they're like you say, like one is like very pathway orientated, regimented. The more you adhere to the rules, the better. Like your life and your career and your success will be. And then completely inverse in startup land. So I do think there's sometimes that disconnect, which is tough to bridge. But there are like some really good dons and donesses in the game that are like being able to now bridge that gap. Like one of my like earliest my earliest mentor, and like still to this day, like probably who's like taught me the most I know. He's called like Jean M. He's
Oh
like
yeah,
the
touch
he was the
surgery.
founder of Touch Surgery, and he literally like so he MindStep got on the news a bit when it was like kind of picking up a bit of traction. I think it was like Evening Standard, like World Alzheimer's Day, like look at these, you know, medical students and frontline doctors that are like building something for Alzheimer's. And Jean saw that, and was like quite far advanced in his touch surgery career and looking to get into the VC space. And I was really, really lucky to find him because he both understood like the medical space. Like he had trained as a surgeon for a bit, but he was like gone through all the pain of being in startup, could like speak the language. He was like, you know, when we say cost effective analysis, that is product market fit. And when we say, you know, you need like low cogs for whatever you're trying to do in your business model, that just translates to like not having a high patient burden or having high hardware costs. He was like really, really useful. And I think the more, hopefully in the future, when we have more genres, we will have like a bringing together of these two worlds.
Agreed. That two worlds thing, I feel that so much, you know, that these sort of general ethoses of startup world versus healthcare world. Like in our company, we have what's called a yes if culture. When someone contributes an idea, you shouldn't just shut it down with that's a terrible idea, because you might say yes if, and then you might label a ridiculous if. But or if you're asked to do something, if you need something done by someone who's full of capacity, it'd be yes if this is dropped or whatever, like the yes if culture. But in healthcare, you can't have someone saying like, oh, maybe we should give this cancer drug for this headache. You can't say yes if to that. Like it's a completely different thing. Like you just can't move fast and break things. You can't move fast and break things in healthcare. So it can be quite alienating, particularly where that tech startup world starts to encroach on healthcare for its clinical people or acumen or space or whatever. You're absolutely right. That can be really difficult. And people like Jean, people that have walked this walk for a long time, and you talked about language there. Language is so important that it can be so alienating for technology people to walk straight into a clinical area and start talking tech or talking business or talking in a language that isn't theirs. And it's so alienating. Adoption's difficult and sales is difficult. Everything becomes more difficult because it's just a complete lack of understanding. And so I think in healthcare, almost more than anything else, like the listening part from the technology side is just so important. And particularly people like yourself that have been clinical. If you've been clinical, you understand those people, you understand what they want and need to hear, you understand what a product might need to be. You come at it almost halfway already, and you're on that learning journey too of the business side, but you know how to communicate it to them. It can be so important. But I want to talk to you about MindStep a bit more, man. So can you tell me, like, whereabouts is MindStep right now? Like, what exactly are you doing? Because on your website, you're doing loads of stuff, right? Like, there's loads of things that the product can do and the technology can do right now. So give that a bit of flavor and a bit of context for us. So, like, what are the things this technology can do now?
Yeah, so I suppose MindStep, for those that may have not stumbled on the website yet, or if you want to afterwards, download it on the App Store. It has two components. It has a screening part, or a clinical assessment part, and then it delivers a digital therapeutic. And it does this for currently the 5 most prevalent neuro and psychiatric conditions in the world. That's anxiety, depression, migraine, early stage dementia, and concussion. And now we're about to, like I said, mentioned in the beginning, we're about to add brain fog onto that as well, which is quite exciting. And maybe classic investor. This is like kind of highlighting the discrepancies of the two worlds. This to an investor, and I always get pushback. Oh, unfocused. Hamzah, what are you doing? Why are you doing 5 different markets? I don't like this. Sometimes I get that. And actually, if you were like now come back to the medicine side, you would know that actually, and our data shows this, most of these conditions actually overlap more than they exist separately. So anxiety, depression one can trigger the other. Depression is a huge risk factor for dementia. Concussion post-concussively can often mask as early stage dementia. Migraine gets confused with concussion. A really cool piece of data we have, but like it just shows that these all exist more in conjunction in our user groups than they do separately. And that's part of the reason why I think some of these digital therapeutics haven't really cracked like brain and mental health yet, because they're very like in startup land, the ideal solution, what you get taught by the Y Combinators and stuff, is like point solution, be really focused, like tackle one problem and do that really well. But actually sometimes in clinical medicine, is a huge iceberg. Like on the surface, yeah, they might be anxious and you could be like, oh yeah, do some meditation. But in reality, you take a bit of a deeper history and stuff. Maybe they're drinking 12 pints every night, right? And you can do all the CBT you want in the world. That's not going to solve the underlying problem. So that was a real reason for us doing multiple conditions. And that's like an example. We talked about how like maybe medicine could use a bit more of a startup mentality. That's a situation where I think startup could use a bit more like, this is how the clinical science should, dictate how you build your product. And then part of like trying to come at this problem from a clinical standpoint was that the fact that these conditions get all these therapeutics. So basically in brain and mental health, I think there is a lot of really great therapies out there. I think like meditation's come really long way and it has a great amount of efficacy. I think the diet stuff that's been coming out is really important and really useful. And we're learning so much. And like the last 50 years have been like really focused on trying to crack this. Where I think it falls down is that all of these different therapeutics don't get matched to the right patients. I think there's a lot of like, because of like the complexity of like clinical pictures and stuff, and the fact that a lot of these, they just look at the surface. I think that's where the failure is. And also the fact that they don't get implemented soon enough in the presentation journey, and it's often too little too late. So our ethos was, all right, we need a really great clinical assessment mechanic in the front. That needs to be a bit broad. That's a bit anti-startup mentality, but clinically makes sense. So it can filter people to the right therapeutics. And we're not going to just build one. We're going to build 120, which we call a MindStep. It's like a short form video-based content that we thought was really evidence-based. And the user journey is that you're going to get screened. It takes about 5 minutes. Then you're going to get your management, what we call management plan, but in MindStep, it's just a care plan. And it's going to consist of a bunch of different care videos. And it's going to be, hopefully, the AI will pick the best possible plan for you. And it's actually machine learning as it goes, right? It's going to keep getting better and better, and it can rescreen you and it can train the algorithm that way.
Let's talk about some of those conditions first. So I'm really interested in 2 things: the early detection of dementia and some other stuff. That's one. The other one I'm interested in is this brain fog thing. So let's start with brain fog. Now, I think you're at a really interesting point if you look at an individual's care journey, because you're going to come in, MindStep's going to come in at the point of reporting symptoms. And you'll know this, at scale, that's incredibly valuable because of trends and all the rest of it. And obviously a trend that you've seen is brain fog keeps coming up. Now, I'm interested in where this goes from here. You said that you're mapping it to other symptoms. You mentioned that you submitted it to a conference. My question is like, is this something that's going to be new on the DSM stuff? Is this going to be a thing? Is it going to be just a symptom? Is it going to be like, how are you seeing brain fog? It was big in COVID as well, by the way. And like, I suffered from it. I mean, I'm one of those people that was reticent to say I suffered from it because I didn't know if it was a real thing, and I didn't know whether like it was a collection of other stuff going on, or it probably I didn't really know how to quantify it in my own mind, let alone telling anybody else, or even telling colleagues that I've forgotten to set up invoicing for the last 6 months because I had brain fog. A true story. Tell me about brain fog. Like, where is this now?
So it's always been there. That's what our initial stances, and what a lot of like the early science says. It can present, obviously COVID kind of popularized it, but it exists, and through our data it shows like fibromyalgia patients, women going through the menopause, chemotherapy. It's always actually been a condition. And then unfortunately, through certain barriers in medicine, not really come to the forefront as it should have. However, in our data, we are constantly doing analysis to try provide the best possible care for our users, and we were seeing this signal of like kind of cognitive impairment that was transient, so like not permanently, but like kind of like intermittent, not going down either, in a younger group where you would not expect like a dementia or something along those lines. And we were like, we threw out some words and we're like, okay, let's see what people are trying to call this and stuff. And brain fog was like coming up as the strongest signal. That's what they were referring to as. I spoke to a bunch of GPs and they were like, yeah, we hear this all the time. No idea what it is. Can't, we just kind of try like match it to something else. And they'll be like, oh, it's a migraine. Oh, it's like your symptom of your concussion. It's just but in reality, we were able to map it to our like cognitive tests, which look at, frontal lobe activity, which look at memory recall, which look at executive function. We were mapping it to certain like PHQ-9 packs and looking at to see if it like shows elements of depression. We were like, does it follow more of a migraine picture where it's like intermittent and has certain triggers, or is it more like a concussion where there's like an insult to the brain and then it's kind of like a wave and then it peters out? So we did loads of what we call like, in machine learning, unsupervised learning. So you don't put any biases on the data, you let it sort of cluster itself. Then we picked it up and kind of drilled it down. I mean, like there's some top neurologists from like Queen Square and Imperial who have all been working really hard on this. And the aim would be to like submit it to NICE so we can, actually empower GPs and like other medics to better define. And then once, you have a bit of a label on something, and it first is reassuring to the patient that they're not like, it's all in their own head. And secondly, we can start to develop like therapy around that.
Yes, that's amazing. And that gives me a really good understanding of what you actually do as well. That gives me a really good understanding of how MindStep works and the value behind it. So I imagine then the early detection of dementia and other things is a similar thing in terms of you're looking at what's coming through and drawing conclusions or finding correlations using machine learning. Is that fair?
Yeah, I mean, so for the dementia stuff, we did a clinical trial, like a multi-centered one across the country, where we built some tests, like some cognitive tests, like and this was like a lot of trial and error. I think we had initially like a huge battery of like 10 different ones, and we were trying them out. Whilst I was on the ward, I would be with my iPhone and a really crap build of MindStep, and I'd be like, hi, excuse me, instead of taking history from you, which I know you've done 30 times to other medical students, would you mind just using my app? And that was my like product research, and like the consultants would be like, oh my God, this student is so keen. But really I was trying to, do make the most out of my medical placements, which is sometimes tough. And we eventually got it down to a couple cognitive tests, and then we did a trial where we showed it to I think it was around 100 patients suffering from MCI, so mild cognitive impairment, early stage dementia, and they were diagnosed by the usual battery of tests that we would do in clinic, like a neuropsychiatrist, etc. And then they would do our app, and then the test was to see, can our app match the gold standard labels that were coming out of the clinical trial. And I was really pleased to say, I can't remember the sensitivity off the top of my head, but maybe you can link it, the paper or something. I think it was about over 90. It was well over 90%, which was really, really cool. Because a lot of people, unfortunately, especially the early stage of dementia, gets completely missed, unfortunately, in primary care, because it's hard to diagnose and it's hard to come forward sometimes with those symptoms as well. So it was a real breakthrough. And the really cool thing about this, which I didn't really appreciate at the time, and we were just focused on sensitivity, like how accurate can we get this, which was the right thing to do in a sense. But the huge advantage is that, granddad and granddad can do this from at home in the comfort of their room, and it takes about 4 minutes. Whereas, I don't know, putting someone through like ADAS cogs, you need an NHS worker there. You need about 2-3 hours of paperwork. You're going to maybe you might get lost to follow up, etc. Confusing. That was the convenience part of the process, was something I didn't really appreciate until now that we have real users using it.
So you talked there about some benefits, some sort of efficiency savings when you look at this at a systems level. So how do you interface with the healthcare system? Is it, because you mentioned people can download it now, if they're normal, I imagine they just use it at home, it's normal, it's told it's normal or similar, and yeah, what if not? Like, how much is this a medical device? Talk to me about that stuff.
Yeah, so it's medical device. It's registered with the NHRA, which is really important to do. But we're very careful with what the scope of MindStep is. Is it a replacement for your GP or neurologist? Absolutely not. Is it something, if you are feeling like you may have some symptoms and you would like to maybe clinically assess yourself in order to maybe go follow up with your GP, or is it maybe you're worried about a loved one and you would like to maybe just do something initial? Essentially, it's a screening. I think that is the best word, because like diagnosis implies like it's very definitive. So it's very much like a screening tool. It's meant to be cost effective, and like any you're taught in medicine, signpost effectively, let the patient safety net them. So we do all of that in the app, and we are very clear like what it is indicated for and what it isn't indicated for, and what are the shortcomings of the test. And as long as you're transparent across those three things, MHRA is thumbs up.
Beautiful. It sounds really cool, man. And I mean, I know it is. I want to talk to you about the funding rounds. You mentioned 3 funding rounds that you've done. So congrats, first of all. That's certainly not easy. I know you've got Octopus on the board and things like that. Tell me about the journey there. Was the idea that you obviously wanted to build the tech quickly, therefore you wanted funding in to pay for a dev team? Like, was that initial thinking? Like, the round subsequent, like, why did you do them? What's the goal here? Can you talk to me about that?
Yeah. So, I mean, our first piece of funding came from an Imperial venture capital competition. I'm not sure they still run it, but it was called VCC at the time. And we got quite far along in it. And I think we got like a couple grand, which at the time I was like, oh my God.
Millionaire.
Oh my God.
Yeah.
I'm loaded. It was really useful. And I still, to this day, I was like, wow, this weird thing, you become so capital efficient when you have nothing, so driven. And that's what it felt like. I was like, wow, I've been really given an opportunity here to make something out of it. Like, why don't I try to take this as far? I'm sure you hear this all the time. Like, try to take it as far as you can. So got lots of traction. I was seeing the product market fit. Jean was seeing the product market fit. He was like, Hams, we should do a funding round. And it was kind of like an angel round. It was like with some really cool people in Jean's network. And we closed that. I was thinking it was like 300K at the time. And I was like, oh my God, 300K. What am I going to do? Now looking back, that was basically like test. It was like, okay, like Hamzah, he's a medical student. Is he just going to run off with the cash? Can we does he know what he's doing? And that was just a real test. And I still think like me and my co-founder Aaron, like one of our best performances like as a team was when we had that 300k. Like we did so much with it. We like, and that was like learning how to manage capital efficiently. That was like spending every penny with like loads of thought behind it. Learning how to use like your stock option pool for like subsidized costs for employees, like all sorts of things we just made a lot of right decisions in a row. We've had phases where we make a lot of wrong decisions in a row, but that was like a really critical point. And then we did then Octopus came in and they were absolutely terrific. I had like a little bit of medical school left. They were like, yeah, Hams, go ahead, finish your medical degree. We actually think as a founder, you'll be more valuable if you've got that doctor title. And I made it really clear. I was like, the reason the product was like phenomenal at the time. It was like head and shoulders above. I hope it still is, but definitely at the time it was like so easy to use. Like elderly patients were using it, 18-year-olds were using it. It was like really standard, and they were like, "You have no product background. Like, how have you and the engineering team pulled this off?" And I was like, "It is because I'm in clinic all day, sat with patients, listening to their user needs, what we call user needs, patient problems, same thing." I was like hearing all of this, and I was like, "That is why like I've not got a product background. I have no idea what really UI UX still stands for, to be honest. But I'm hearing all of these things, and I'm hearing like, I can see that the elderly, shake with their finger, and I can on the screen, and I'm like, okay, buttons need to be big. That makes sense in my head. So it was all of those like things that I'm really grateful Octopus value, because you sometimes hear like there's always this debate, like should founders be full time? Like that is like almost like if you're not full time, you almost can't raise.
Yeah.
And sometimes you see it on Dragon's Den a bit. They'll be like, "Oh, I think you should leave your job to do this." And I think that's a bit brutal. Like it's very easy to say as a dragon, yeah, go. They've got like loads of money. You might have to be working 2 jobs to support yourself and your family. I really don't like that mentality. But I also think there's a huge advantage to being in not that I was doing 2 jobs, like one was education, one was like being a founder, but there is like if they're well aligned, I think there's a huge like synergy that can happen that sometimes gets lost on some investors.
Yeah. And you know what, mate, like I've been part of those conversations as well, and like you're right, it's often another binary thing for investors. If you're not going to leave that, then you can't do this, you're not committed, all of these things. Conclusions are drawn from the decision for which they might not know all the information. And what I want to come back to, actually, what this reminds me of is what we talked about with that feedback conversation. You're someone who wants context to be part of any conversation, seemingly. You're someone who in the product, you want as much context as possible, which is why you're going to sit in clinic and ask every single patient about every single thing so that you have full context. It seems like your framework is about give me the most amount of information and data in order to make the best decision. That seems to be a common thread here running through this, because I think that context is incredibly important, because I live in the grey too. I've talked about this a lot. Like I feel comfortable with 2 things can be true at the same time. And I feel comfortable with the world doesn't need, it's either this or it's this. It can be both. I just need the amount of information to prove it. I need to prove that I can find a way and make both of things true if you just give me all the information. And so I really relate to you on that. And I really relate to you as well that so much of business can be common sense. Now, that can be quite an inflammatory statement. I think people can, take that badly or whatever, because of course you can be experts in certain things. But to your point about not really understanding what UI UX is or what it stands for, but actually you're more than willing to simply do the work and figure out, well, what does this practically need to look like and be like in order for the patient to experience it well? Well, isn't that user experience, So it seems to me that you definitely want context for everything. And that's a wonderful framework for running a business, because so much of it is in the grey. And of course, we need to go quickly. And as leaders and as a CEO, I'm sure that you need to make decisions where you have to act on not as much information as you like, of course, but where you can get it, I think context is so important. And I think you've consistently proved that in this conversation. I don't know if any of that is relatable.
Thank you. I really appreciate it. I just think it's important to I think we're a data and AI company fundamentally, and it'd be a bit hypocritical if we weren't utilizing all of the data inputs and everything we could. Like, what? That makes no sense. Like, you got to diversify your data, label it well, input it all in, and see what comes out. Like, that's fundamentals of AI. I don't really get more than that, to be honest. But feels like you should practice what you preach.
I agree, mate. I agree. Listen, dude, I've really enjoyed this. I feel like I've learned a lot from you. I really appreciate. If I'm going to take anything away, I'm going to take that. What I'm going to take what you said about feedback away, and I'm gonna tell people that I'm gonna recount this story quite a lot, because I do get asked when people come to me and they're bruised by their feedback, but people might want to ask them a bit more about what makes that person say that exact thing.
I mean, like, yeah, it's hard. It's hard to develop like thick skin, and I've definitely gone away and cried in a corner and come back. But the important thing is like to come back and just like breathe, have your cry, like that's important. But then like wipe the tears away, and like, you know, like in an Oski, go to that next station, like, and try again. Like, think, reflect, go back.
Beautiful. And that is wonderful, full circle, mate. So thank you for that. Do my job for me, just like an Oski. There's no point letting that one bad station ruin the next 10. Indeed, learn from it and move on. Absolutely. Here. Mate, MindStep. So if people want to, you said people can download it. So I imagine if you're worried about something yourself, if you're worried about a loved one, like, where can people find it, and how do they learn more about it?
Yeah, so it's currently just on the App Store, Android coming soon, with this new funding, which has been like in quite high demand, which is nice, but like not more technically challenging for the engineers, but it's going to be really, really cool, and we're really excited to deliver it. We have like an Android waitlist. You can sign up to be like an early beta tester, but if not, just try and nick your mate's iPhone and have a play with it at least.
Excellent. And if people want to learn more about you or the company, where's the best place for them to go?
Yeah, I mean, you can go to our website, letsmindstep.com, and there's an email at the bottom, info@letsmindstep.com, and we plugged straight into a Slack channel, so we are very vigilantly watching and always keen to hear feedback.